The morning began as quietly as any other, with sunlight spilling lazily across the wooden floor, brushing the edges of furniture in a soft gold light. The kettle had begun its slow whistle, steam curling like a forgotten thought, and the faint scent of brewed coffee lingered in the corners of the kitchen. Everything seemed ordinary, familiar, the rhythms of a home that had carried countless small, ordinary joys. But there was a stillness beneath the ordinary, a weight that pressed quietly against the chest, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The clock ticked, louder than usual, as if each second was measuring not just time, but the fragile thread holding everything together. She reached for the cup, hands slightly trembling, and felt the warmth of the ceramic grounding her, but only barely. Something felt shifted. The letter lay on the counter, its edges crisp, unassuming, almost invisible against the beige countertop. Yet in that stillness, it held a gravity that the morning could not lighten. The envelope was stark white, its silence louder than any words could be. She traced the outline with her fingertip, hesitating, a quiet tremor running through her. Coffee steam mingled with the nervous warmth of her palms, rising in delicate clouds that blurred the edges of reality. She remembered the way mornings used to feel here. Laughter spilling over toast crumbs, the soft murmur of conversation while hands busied themselves with breakfast. How strange, how cruel it was that now, in this very room, there was only a hush that seemed to echo, pressing against her ears. The world outside the window looked unchanged, the same tree branches swaying in the morning breeze, the same distant hum of traffic, but within the house, everything felt fragile, suspended. Her gaze drifted toward the closet. The white coat hung there, once a symbol of long nights, of achievement, of pride. Now it felt different. Silent. Cold. A marker of a life that had moved forward without her. A triumph that had arrived on the very day it should have been celebrated together. There was a subtle ache, a quiet disbelief, a trembling that had no words. How could life continue when something so central had suddenly fractured? The wedding ring, resting in its familiar place on the counter, seemed almost to vibrate with meaning. Every curve of its gold held decades of memories. The laughter, the whispers, the small acts of love repeated until they became invisible, taken for granted. And now, in the soft morning light, it felt both familiar and painfully alien. A relic of a shared past she could no longer trust to exist in the present. She breathed slowly, almost mechanically, feeling the tension coil and uncoil within her. Her mind drifted through fragments of memory, the way he had smiled that morning, the way the sun had caught his hair, the small jokes whispered over steaming cups of coffee. And then the stillness returned. The envelope, the paper inside, though unread, already heavy with quiet consequence. Outside, the birds continued their morning chorus, oblivious to the tremor that had shaken her world. The clock ticked again, marking another moment of ordinary life moving relentlessly forward. And she wondered silently, almost to herself, how the world could continue in its calm rhythm when the heart of her life had abruptly shifted, leaving a quiet void where once there had been certainty. Maybe it was just the beginning of understanding. Perhaps some mornings were meant to remind us of fragility, of the quiet tremors that linger beneath the surface of ordinary days. She traced the edge of the envelope one more time, a soft exhale escaping her lips, tasting faintly of coffee and disbelief. And in that pause, between one tick and the next, she felt the weight of absence and the first echo of what was about to unfold. The world outside carried on. The sun climbed slowly, spilling light into the corners of the room, but within, she felt suspended, caught in the delicate balance between memory and loss. The letter was still there, waiting, and she knew, deep down, that the life she had understood so completely only yesterday had shifted irrevocably in the quiet of this very morning, and in that stillness, she waited. Not with anger, not yet with grief, but with a trembling awareness that nothing would ever feel the same again. The house carried the echoes of a life that once felt whole, a warmth that lingered even in the quiet. The walls still smelled faintly of meals cooked in hurried mornings, of bread breaking against fingertips, of coffee that had always been too strong and too comforting at once. Every corner held fragments of memory, the soft hum of laughter that had bounced from one room to the next, the subtle creak of the stairs worn by years of shared steps, the faded sunlight that always seemed to settle across the wooden floors in the same familiar patterns. She wandered through the room slowly, as if moving through a photograph she could almost touch. The living room sofa, worn yet welcoming, still bore the faint indentation of the evenings spent in shared quiet. The novels read aloud, the murmured dreams that seemed too small to matter, but were the foundations of a life built together. She could almost hear the laughter echoing from that very space, though now it was only a memory, a faint vibration beneath the walls, soft and unreal. In the kitchen, the scent of spices and simmering sauces clung faintly to the air, like a memory refusing to fade. How many mornings had she poured coffee into 2 mugs and set them on the counter, waiting for the soft shuffle of his footsteps, the murmured, "good morning," that always came just after the kettle whistled. Those small acts, repeated endlessly, had built the invisible threads that wove their lives together, threads that now felt fragile, taut, ready to snap. The bedroom, too, carried its own stories. She traced the edge of the bedspread, soft under her fingers, and recalled the quiet intimacy of nights spent together, whispered conversations in the dark, shared warmth, the unspoken comfort of a presence that once felt absolute. And yet, even in those cherished moments, she remembered the subtle shifts, the gentle distances that had begun to emerge. He had started staying up later, buried in books and notes, eyes tired but shining with ambition. She had watched from the doorway, pride mingling with the faint ache of absence, not realizing then how those small gaps would widen into unbridgeable spaces. There were mornings when the house seemed to breathe along with them, echoing their routines, the soft clatter of dishes, the hum of the coffee machine, the quiet murmur of conversation. And there were evenings when it seemed to sigh under the weight of silences they hadn't yet named, tensions unspoken, feelings postponed. The rhythm of their life was both comforting and delicate, a dance of closeness and subtle distance that had gone unnoticed until it had grown too large to ignore. She remembered the early days, the way he had smiled at the smallest victories, passing an exam, mastering a recipe, fixing a leaky faucet, and she remembered her own pride in him, in the man who had seemed to carry the world lightly on his shoulders, even when the night stretched long and his ambitions pulled him away from the life they were building. Each achievement had been a thread woven into the fabric of their shared existence, a testament to perseverance and dedication. And yet, with each thread, a quiet tension had begun to emerge, subtle as a shadow at dusk. Evenings by the window brought their own memories, the soft glow of streetlights filtering through sheer curtains, the smell of rain lingering in the cool air, the quiet companionship of shared reading or muted television. She remembered the small gestures, a hand reaching across the table, a smile that lingered a second too long, a cup of tea placed just so, a note left on the pillow. These were the moments that had made life feel like a home, not just a house. And now, moving through the same rooms, she felt the absence of those gestures like a hollow ache, each object a reminder of what once was. The path of his ambition had been intertwined with their daily life. The nights spent studying, the early mornings before dawn, the long hours in hospitals, and the late-night phone calls from classmates and colleagues. All of it had been part of a shared journey, even when it seemed to pull him away. She had been proud, endlessly proud, even as a quiet loneliness took root. She remembered the conversations, the laughter tinged with fatigue, the small arguments about time and priorities, and she realized now that those had been the first signs of the fissures to come. There were objects that carried memory like a faint perfume, the worn stethoscope on the bookshelf, the stack of notebooks that smelled faintly of ink and ambition, the small handwritten notes tucked into drawers and pockets. Each one held a fragment of their story, moments of pride, moments of tenderness, and moments of unspoken distance. And she walked among them now, tracing their edges, letting memory flood through her with the weight of nostalgia and the ache of recognition. The laughter that had once filled the hallway now seemed like a whisper from another life. She remembered the way he had teased her, the way she had laughed until her chest ached, the the small, private jokes that belonged only to them. And yet, even as she recalled those times, she sensed the first cracks in the smile, the subtle shift toward silence that had grown over the years, achievements celebrated alone, triumphs shared only with strangers. These had been the quiet signs, unnoticed at the time, of a distance that was growing imperceptibly, but inexorably. The smell of old coffee, lingering on the counter, brought with it the memory of mornings when the sun fell gently across the kitchen tiles, warming the small rituals that had once seemed so ordinary. And perhaps it was in the ordinariness that the beauty had lived, the quiet strength of being seen, of sharing life in ways that were small but profound. She remembered the way their hands would brush over dishes, the quiet nods of understanding, the comfort of knowing someone else existed in the same rhythm of the day. And yet, in that reflection, she could also see the beginnings of the silence that would come. The nights spent apart in thought, the conversations that grew terse, the ambitions that pulled him farther away. It had been subtle, imperceptible, almost invisible in the daily warmth of living. But memory, as it always does, held the truth in delicate detail. Every laugh, every shared meal, every soft touch carried the weight of love in the faint, growing echo of absence. The life they had built together was a mosaic of joy and longing, intimacy and quiet distance. Each memory was a brushstroke, vivid and imperfect, creating a portrait that was at once beautiful and fragile. She moved through the house slowly, reverently, feeling the weight of the past settle around her. It was in the laughter she could no longer hear, in the rooms that no longer echoed with shared presence, that the full measure of love and loss revealed itself. Even in the quiet, there was warmth, a lingering echo of the life that had smiled here, of hands held, dreams whispered, and moments cherished. And as she lingered, tracing the contours of memory like a map of something once vital, she realized that this warmth, fragile and fleeting though it might be, would always be part of her. The house, the objects, the small rituals, all of it held the story of a love that had been real, imperfect and human. And so she paused in the living room, sunlight falling softly across the floor, hands brushing over the furniture, breathing in the memory of laughter, of love, of small ordinary happiness. The past was alive in the quiet, holding her gently, reminding her that even when distance and ambition had begun to carve their marks, the life they had shared had been beautiful, and it had mattered. The day had arrived with a brightness that should have been celebratory. Sunlight poured through the window, brushing the kitchen table in soft gold, the kind of morning that whispered of new beginnings. Yet, beneath the ordinary calm, an unsettling stillness had settled. The house, familiar and warm, felt somehow heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He had reached the pinnacle of his ambition, the moment he had worked toward with tireless dedication. A doctor now, officially and formally, a title that carried the weight of years of study, sacrifice, and late nights spent alone in quiet determination. She had watched him the night before, eyes tired but alight with anticipation, the pride in her chest swelling as he recounted every exam, every step, every hurdle overcome. She had imagined the celebration, the congratulations, the smiles that would light up the room. The house had seemed to hold its breath in eager expectation, too, as if ready to share in their triumph. And then the stillness had broken in the smallest, most ordinary gesture, a letter, slipped silently onto the counter, crisp, unassuming, and yet carrying a weight that no words of congratulations could match. Her hands had trembled as she unfolded it, the paper smooth yet cold against her fingertips. The words printed there were simple, formal, yet they cut deeper than any scream, louder than any shouted anger. Divorce, filed, effective immediately. She read it once. Then again, the letters blurred and sharpened, a cruel echo bouncing between disbelief and understanding. How could such an ordinary sheet of paper contain a rupture so absolute? How could life's sweetness turn so bitter in a single stroke? The room seemed to shrink, the sunlight suddenly harsh against her skin, the shadows of the morning deepening in corners that had always felt safe. Pride and devastation collided, leaving her breathless. She had always celebrated his victories, always stood at the edge of his ambition with gentle support and quiet pride. She had waited in the quiet hours, poured coffee, mended clothes, and held the home steady while he chased a dream that now shone brighter than their life together. And in that same brilliance, she realized, her place had quietly vanished. Objects around the room suddenly took on a new weight. The wedding ring on the dresser gleamed with a soft irony, a symbol of promises once sacred, now silently unmoored. The white coat, crisp and freshly pressed, hung neatly on the closet door, a testament to years of devotion and hard work. But now to her, it felt like an emblem of absence. Even the letter, stark and unyielding, carried more presence than the warmth she had known in his hands for so many years. She sank into the chair by the window, letting the morning sunlight wash over her, and allowed herself to breathe. Each inhale was heavy with disbelief, each exhale trembling with grief. The mind could not yet make sense of the collision. Triumph and silence, achievement and abandonment, joy and heartbreak all entwined in one cruel symmetry. The very thing she had been proudest of, the long hours, the dedication, the focus, had somehow become the instruments of her isolation. And yet, amid the storm of betrayal, flashes of memory surfaced. She remembered nights spent studying together in quieter years, shared cups of tea on worn wooden tables, whispered encouragements in the dim glow of lamps. She remembered the laugh that had once filled this very space, soft and warm and now absent. Even as she mourned the life that had been, the life she thought they were building, there was the faint glimmer of recognition. He had pursued his dreams as they had both hoped, and she had loved him for it. That love had not vanished. It had simply collided with a reality she could not yet comprehend. Her thoughts drifted to the small rituals of daily life, the unnoticed moments that had defined intimacy, folded laundry, morning smiles, the shared rhythm of routines that spoke louder than words. And now, with those rituals broken, she felt the magnitude of absence in every corner. The empty kitchen, the silent hallway, the weight of a bed half empty. She lingered over the photograph on the mantel, his face smiling, oblivious to the tears that would follow, the tenderness that would soon be replaced by quiet sorrow. The paradox of the day was cruel. She could celebrate his success in one breath and mourn their loss in the next. Pride and grief coexisted, impossible to separate, each amplifying the other. The room seemed to pulse with memory, objects resonating with meaning she could no longer claim for herself. Even the ticking clock seemed accusatory, each second a reminder that life, indifferent and relentless, moved forward regardless of human suffering. Time slowed as she sat there, letting the silence speak, letting the sun trace patterns across her hands and the wooden floor. She traced the edge of the wedding album, fingers lingering over the images of shared smiles, of vacations and quiet dinners, of milestones that had seemed eternal at the time. The photographs, once a celebration of love, now felt like silent witnesses to the impermanence of human connection. She let her mind wander, replaying moments that had seemed insignificant, touches, looks, small gestures, and realized they had been the glue of their lives, subtle and unspoken. And in that realization, a new feeling emerged, not anger, not bitterness, but quiet mourning. The kind of sorrow that settles slowly, a gentle ache rather than a cry of rage. She understood in the hush of that morning that some ruptures cannot be reasoned away. Achievement, ambition, love, and absence could coexist in the same room, and she was left to navigate the complexity alone. The sunlight shifted, brushing against the letter again, highlighting the words that had changed everything. She did not fold it neatly or throw it away. She simply let it rest beside her, a reminder that life could be both beautiful and cruel, both triumphant and lonely. In the quiet, she allowed herself to sit with the tension, to breathe through the paradox, to recognize that heartbreak and pride could occupy the same space without diminishing either. The day stretched long, yet still she sat, letting emotion settle into its natural rhythm. Triumph and silence, she thought, are not opposites. They are companions in the landscape of human experience. And as the house held its breath with her, she realized that this was only the beginning of a journey through grief, reflection, and eventual understanding. The morning had changed everything, but it had not yet defined the entirety of what she would come to feel, or who she would become. The house felt different now. Every corner, Every hallway carried the echo of footsteps that no longer existed, the gentle hum of life replaced by a hollow, persistent silence. Morning light still poured through the windows, brushing the walls with the familiar warmth of daybreak, but it no longer felt comforting. It only highlighted the emptiness, the quiet spaces where laughter used to ripple, where voices once intertwined like threads in a tapestry now unraveling. She moved from room to room, letting her fingers brush against the edges of familiar furniture, tracing the worn contours of chairs, the smooth surfaces of tables. Objects once imbued with shared meaning, his coat left on the back of the sofa, the coffee mug still warm from a morning routine that would never repeat, now seemed alien, relics of a life suspended in memory. She paused, listening to the hollow hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the floor beneath her feet, and the faint ticking of a clock that seemed to mark not hours, but absence itself. Memory arrived unbidden, vivid and sharp. She could still see the mornings when the kitchen table was alive with conversation, the smell of toast mingling with the rich aroma of coffee, the sun filtering through curtains as they spoke of dreams and small daily victories. She remembered the evening walks, the quiet dinners, the gentle teasing that would leave them laughing in unison. Each memory was both comforting and piercing, a reminder of what once existed and what had quietly slipped away. Objects around her became metaphors for loss. The half-empty wine bottle on the counter reminded her of evenings meant to be shared, now spent in solitude. The wedding photograph on the mantel, a smiling image frozen in time, seemed to stare back with a quiet reproach, a reminder that the life it captured was no longer hers. Even the bed, half empty and unmade, carried the weight of nights spent turning toward someone who was no longer there. Every item, every object, became a subtle emblem of abandonment. The solitude pressed upon her, not with fury, but with a gentle, suffocating heaviness. Nights were the hardest, when the house's quietness amplified every thought, every memory, every echo of laughter. She could hear the imagined sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the soft click of a closing door, the rustle of sheets on the side that would remain empty. She lay awake, tracing the contours of absence with her mind, each beat of her heart a reminder that life had shifted irrevocably. In these long hours, grief took its own shape, curling quietly around her chest. It was not just sadness. It was the questioning of self, of worth, of what had gone unseen. Was she enough? Had she loved enough? The walls, steeped in the memory of shared life, offered no answers, only reflection. She thought of conversations left incomplete, of subtle signs overlooked, of moments when a glance or a gesture might have been a warning or a bridge. And yet, she also realized that no single act could have held what had already begun to unravel. Even as the grief deepened, memory persisted. Moments of warmth, care, and fleeting joy. A song from the old record player, the scent of his cologne lingering faintly in a closet, the folded laundry waiting patiently on the chair, all whispered of lives intertwined, of love that had been real and vital. And in that persistence, she began to recognize the duality of human experience, joy and sorrow, presence and absence, memory and reality, coexisting in the same fragile space. She moved slowly through the rooms, pausing at each doorway, letting her eyes linger on what remained. The kitchen held the faint smell of burned toast from a morning long past. The living room curtains fluttered softly in a breeze that carried the scent of rain from outside. The walls, once silent witnesses to laughter and conversation, now held a quiet reverence for the absence within. She walked through it all with careful steps, tracing invisible lines between memory and reality, learning slowly to inhabit a house that no longer felt like hers in the same way. And yet, even in this quiet desolation, a subtle awareness began to form. She noticed the resilience in herself, the ability to move through these rooms, to breathe in their emptiness, to touch objects without being consumed by them. She understood that grief was not a wall to scale, but a tide to navigate, each wave bringing both pain and reflection, both memory and insight. The rooms did not mock her sorrow. They held it, reverberated with it, and eventually whispered a fragile promise of endurance. Time passed, measured not in days or hours, but in the gentle rhythms of living in absence. She allowed herself to remember fully, to mourn fully, to feel the sharp edges of betrayal and loss. And yet, she also began to see the soft light between the shadows. Each empty room became a space for reflection, a canvas upon which grief painted its delicate, complicated strokes. And though the ache remained, she sensed the possibility of moving through it, of learning to live alongside it, carrying memory and loss together in quiet, human companionship. By the end of these long hours, the house no longer felt like a prison, though it was heavy with absence. It had become a sanctuary of reflection, where grief and memory intertwined, where pain could be acknowledged without overwhelming, where silence could be felt as a presence rather than a void. And as she stood in the doorway of the living room, sunlight spilling across the floor, she allowed herself to simply be, present, aware, aching, yet quietly enduring. The echoes of empty rooms had taught her something subtle and profound, that even in absence, life leaves traces, and even in grief, the heart learns to navigate, step by careful step. Rain fell softly against the window pane, each drop tracing a quiet path down the glass, leaving behind tiny trails that caught the pale light of afternoon. She sat by the window, hands wrapped around a warm mug, feeling the subtle chill of the room seep into her bones, mingling with the lingering ache in her chest. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious to the quiet turbulence within her, while inside, she allowed herself to pause, to sit with the memories, the questions, and the faint stirrings of understanding. The rain became a companion, gentle and patient, tapping in rhythm with her heartbeat. She closed her eyes for a moment and let memory drift over her. Soft as the water against the window, she remembered mornings filled with laughter, shared routines, the unspoken comforts of small gestures that once bound them together. The smell of breakfast cooking, the quiet hum of conversation over steaming mugs of coffee, the brush of a hand along her arm as if to say, "I see you. You are here, and so am I." These moments had been ordinary, yet they had carried the extraordinary weight of love, and yet the memory of absence was equally vivid. She recalled the silent dinners, the long evenings alone, the way a glance could pass without recognition, the subtle drift of life's paths diverging quietly, almost imperceptibly. The contrast between what was and what had become pressed upon her, heavy as the clouds outside. She let herself breathe through it, acknowledging that grief and understanding could coexist, that memory could hurt even as it illuminated truths previously unseen. In her lap rested an old photograph, edges softened by time, corners curling slightly. She traced the faces in it with gentle fingertips, not searching for blame, but for comprehension. There he was, smiling, ambitious, radiant in his own achievements, yet unknowingly leaving fractures in the world they had built together. She realized that he had always been striving for something beyond herself, something noble in ambition, yet it had come at a cost she could no longer ignore. She did not hate him, nor did she love him in the same uncomplicated way she once had. Instead, she felt a quiet clarity, the recognition that people are complex, that love is not always enough, and that loss often carries its own lessons. She opened an old letter, folded carefully in a drawer she hadn't dared touch in months. Its ink had faded slightly, but the words remained, echoes of a past filled with hope and tenderness. As she read them, a warmth mingled with the ache, a bittersweet awareness of what had been real and what had been lost. Tears came quietly, unannounced, not as a torrent, but as a soft acknowledgement of the human heart's fragility. The rain continued, almost in sympathy, washing the world outside while she washed the landscape of her own memories, allowing clarity to settle amidst the residue of pain. The afternoon stretched gently, time bending to the rhythm of reflection. She thought of the life they had shared, the small triumphs, the little betrayals, the silent compromises, the unspoken disappointments. She considered her own choices, her patience, her sacrifices, and the quiet strength that had carried her through the months of solitude. She understood that grief was not a weakness, nor was introspection a retreat. It was the work of the heart, the slow tending of wounds invisible to the world. Sunlight began to filter through the gray clouds, soft and diffused, glinting on the raindrops still clinging to the glass. She watched as the light moved across the room, touching familiar surfaces: the worn armchair, the table where breakfast once waited, the stack of books she had been meaning to read. Each object became a symbol, not of absence, but of endurance. She realized that objects, memories, even pain could coexist within her, each with a place and a meaning. The rain, which had once mirrored her melancholy, now seemed like a gentle cleansing, a reminder that life continued to flow, carrying both sorrow and insight. She picked up a small trinket from the table, a ring, once heavy with love and now light in its absence. Holding it, she let herself remember without anger, reflect without despair. She thought of how people change, how priorities shift, and how love sometimes transforms into something quieter, less immediate, but still profoundly real. She understood that forgiveness was not about reconciliation, nor about absolution, but about freeing the heart from lingering bitterness, creating space for gentle healing. The hours passed slowly, each one a meditation on memory, presence, and the lessons embedded in quiet grief. She noticed how the rhythm of the rain mirrored the rhythm of her thoughts, sometimes persistent, sometimes gentle, always moving forward. She allowed herself to feel gratitude for the clarity that came with reflection, for the insight that suffering often brings, and for the subtle resilience within herself that had carried her through the echoes of empty rooms. By evening, the rain had softened into a light drizzle, and the world beyond the window glimmered with the promise of continuation. She felt a calm begin to settle over her, a delicate awareness that life was not defined solely by absence or betrayal, but by the quiet strength of endurance, the tender work of understanding, and the capacity to find softness even amidst grief. She placed the letter back into the drawer, the photograph on the table, and leaned back into the chair, feeling the pulse of life within her own chest, steady and real. The reflection did not erase pain, nor did it offer immediate closure. Instead, it created a space, a gentle room within her heart, where memory, understanding, and compassion could coexist. Rain on the window, thoughts in the heart, she realized, were not just reflections of sorrow. They were the first signs of emotional awakening, the subtle beginning of letting go while still honoring what had been. And as the last droplets slid down the glass, she allowed herself to simply be, breathing, remembering, and embracing the soft clarity that had begun to emerge from the shadows of loss. The room felt lighter now. Though the air still carried the faint echoes of what had been, she moved slowly, deliberately, letting each motion be a reminder that life continued, even after the weight of absence. The morning sunlight spilled through the window, soft and forgiving, touching the edges of familiar furniture and painting them with gentle warmth. She ran her fingers over the surface of the table, over the objects that had once carried 1,000 memories, photographs, letters, a wedding ring, and for the first time in months, they felt like companions, not anchors. There was a quiet rhythm to her actions, a meditation in the mundane. She wrote a note, not addressed to anyone, a small acknowledgement of her own journey, of grief, reflection, and the tentative steps toward peace. The words were simple, almost fragile, yet each one carried a weight of honesty she had not allowed herself before. She placed it carefully on the table, alongside a cup of coffee still warm, the scent mingling with the faint aroma of rain lingering in the room. It was her offering to herself, a gesture of continuity, of self-recognition, of tender care. Outside, the garden called softly, the leaves glistening from the earlier rain. She stepped outside, feeling the damp earth beneath her feet, letting the cool air brush against her skin. There was a strange comfort in tending the plants, in nurturing life that demanded patience and attention, but offered no judgment. She pruned a rosebush, turned the soil gently, and noticed how even small acts of care returned a measure of peace. Her hands, once trembling from sorrow, now moved with quiet purpose, guided by presence and the subtle wisdom that comes with time. The objects that had once seemed to mock her, reminders of love lost, promises unkept, dreams that had dissolved, began to reclaim their meaning. The ring, once heavy with heartbreak, now rested lightly in a jewelry box, its shine reflecting a different kind of memory, one of love given and received, of beauty found in ordinary days. The letters, once painful to touch, were now read for the lessons they offered, for the warmth they held when the heart was ready to remember without despair. Even the divorce papers, crisp and final, became a symbol of transition, marking not just an ending, but the gentle opening of space for herself. She allowed herself to reconnect with the world beyond the house, a call to an old friend, laughter that bubbled quietly through a conversation, the joy of shared memory and recognition. Each interaction was a small tether to life, reminding her that isolation was temporary, and connection could be found in the softest places. She walked slowly through the neighborhood, observing the rhythm of others' lives, feeling the pulse of human existence intertwining with her own. The sight of children playing, of neighbors greeting each other with ease, of a dog chasing the wind, it reminded her that life, though altered, was still vibrant and available to those who reached for it. Evening came with a subtle hush, a soft descent of golden light across the floor. She sat by the window once more, a warm cup in hand, reflecting on the small victories of the day. Each breath, each action, was a reclaiming of her own time, her own presence, her own heart. She recognized that letting go was not a singular act of release, but a continuum, an ongoing willingness to allow memories to exist without holding them hostage, to embrace change without forgetting the past, to nurture life even when it felt fragile. She thought about love, its impermanence, its intensity, its quiet ways of teaching endurance. She understood that forgiving, for herself or for another, was not an erasure of the past, but a reclamation of her own peace. Holding on to resentment would have kept her bound to a chapter that had already closed. Letting go allowed her to inhabit the next pages fully, aware and tender, with hands ready to nurture not only her surroundings but herself. The room grew dimmer as night approached, but she felt an inner warmth that did not depend on sunlight or weather. She lit a candle, its flame small yet unwavering, and let the glow illuminate the familiar corners of the room. Shadows danced softly on the walls, mirroring the dance of memory and acceptance within her. She reflected on the months of grief, the moments of despair, the nights of silence that had once seemed endless. And now she felt a subtle strength, the recognition that sorrow and healing could coexist, that remembrance and moving forward were not opposites but companions. She placed her hands gently on the objects before her, on the letters, the photograph, the ring, and whispered, in the quietest part of herself, a gentle acknowledgement. She was ready to release the hold of pain, to let memory live without suffocating, to exist in the world with openness once again. The act was simple, intimate, unceremonious, yet it carried profound weight. The hands that had clutched so tightly to grief now opened, inviting life, peace, and self-compassion to enter. Night fully descended, and the candle's flame flickered softly, reflecting in her eyes. She watched it, noticing the subtle play of light and shadow, the delicate warmth it brought to the space. She realized that healing did not arrive as a grand declaration, but as small, persistent gestures, a willingness to care for oneself, to acknowledge both absence and presence, to find meaning in continuity. Her hands rested gently on her lap, and she allowed herself a quiet sigh, the sound almost absorbed by the stillness around her. For the first time in months, she felt a measure of ease. The storm within had not vanished entirely, but it had softened. She was learning that peace was not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of acceptance. The hands that once trembled with despair now moved with intention, tenderness, and trust in the quiet unfolding of life. And as she leaned back in the chair, feeling the pulse of her own existence, she understood that letting go was not a single act of courage. It was a continuous, gentle surrender to the rhythm of living, to the wisdom of memory, and to the subtle strength within herself. The morning light spilled gently across the room, touching the familiar edges of furniture and filling the quiet space with warmth. She sat in the chair by the window, the one that had once been shared, now holding only her presence. The sunlight fell in a soft golden patch, illuminating the empty spaces and casting long, tender shadows across the floor. There was no rush, no urgency, just the gentle passage of time, as if the day itself understood the delicate balance of memory and acceptance she carried. Her gaze lingered on the small, ordinary objects around her, the folded letters, the wedding ring resting quietly in its box, the photographs that held laughter and fleeting joy. Each one was no longer heavy with pain, but alive with remembrance. She traced the edges of a photo with her fingertip, the image a whisper of love that had been and still existed in subtle ways. She realized that life did not demand forgetting, nor did it require clinging. There was a quiet freedom in allowing memory to exist without dominance, in letting the past breathe alongside the present. Outside, the world moved in its own rhythm, birds calling, leaves brushing against the window, the distant hum of life continuing. She noticed the small details, a ribbon caught in the sunlight, the way the morning breeze carried the scent of rain from the garden, the faint echo of laughter remembered but no longer mourned. It struck her that beauty and loss often coexist, each defining the other, each shaping the soul in ways both gentle and profound. She breathed slowly, feeling the quiet pulse of her own existence, and in that rhythm, she found a deep, soft strength. Her mind wandered through the months that had passed, the grief, the solitude, the tears that had come unbidden in the silent hours. She remembered the evenings of reflection, the small victories of letting go, the acts of care for herself that had slowly returned life's color to her days. And in that reflection, she understood something fundamental. Survival was not measured by the absence of pain, but by the willingness to continue, to embrace the ordinary, to let sunlight touch even the empty spaces of the heart. She leaned back, in the chair, letting the warmth fill her chest, and felt a gentle resolve settle over her. The past had shaped her, yes, but it no longer defined her. The empty chair beside her was not a symbol of loss alone, but a testament to resilience, to the capacity of the heart to hold memory, love, and self-compassion all at once. She allowed herself a small smile, not loud or triumphant, but quiet, real, and entirely her own. Life had shifted, changed, and yet it was still here, waiting, soft and patient, to be lived. The sunlight shifted slowly across the room as the day moved on, and she felt a harmony between memory and presence, sorrow and peace. The quiet strength she had cultivated whispered gently, love and ambition, betrayal and healing, absence and presence. Each had a place in her story. She understood now that living fully did not erase the past, but embraced it, holding it lightly, letting it illuminate the beauty of the ordinary. And as she sat there, in the calm glow of the morning, the empty chair beside her no longer felt like absence. It felt like a companion, a witness to her journey, a space for quiet reflection and growth. Sometimes, she realized, surviving quietly becomes the greatest act of love we can offer ourselves. The heart learns not by clinging, not by demanding, but by opening gently, letting the light of life touch it, and allowing memories to linger softly, like sunlight on an empty chair.